January 1943. The Tunisian winter sky shimmered with Mediterranean light, thin and cold at altitude, bright enough to bleach the olive-drab camouflage of the new arrivals until they looked almost silver. Below, Luftwaffe mechanics from Jagdgeschwader 53 shaded their eyes and squinted upward as a strange shape crossed the horizon, twin tails, twin engines, and a fuselage that seemed to end abruptly in mid-air before reappearing in duplicate. Someone laughed. Ein fliegender Spaten, a flying shovel. Others joined in, their voices sharp with derision and the confidence of men who had fought Spitfires and Yak 9 seconds and lived to mock newcomers. The aircraft was America's newest twin-engine fighter, the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, and to the German veterans who watched its debut over Tunisia, it looked absurd. To men trained in the elegant logic of the Bf-109 or the compact aggression of the TW-190, this fork-tailed contraption appeared heavy, awkward, and overcomplicated, an engineer's daydream that would never survive the crucible of combat. Within days, a nickname spread through radio chatter and ready rooms, der Gabelschwanz-Teufel, the fork-tailed devil. The joke was meant to sting, a way of reducing the new enemy to caricature. But like all jokes born of unease, it carried a nervous undertone. The first clashes over Tunisia seemed to confirm the laughter. Pilots of JG-27 and JG-77, hardened veterans from North Africa and the Eastern Front, found the P-38 seconds easy prey in a turning fight. The Lightning's long wings and heavy controls made it slow to roll. At medium altitudes, its twin Allison engines lost their edge, leaving it sluggish in climb and ponderous in maneuver. When one Staffel tangled with a flight from the 14th Fighter Group near Gabes in February, the Americans lost 3 aircraft in as many minutes. German gun camera footage captured one Lightning attempting a flat turn, both engines overboosted, the inner wing stalling before the aircraft snapped into a smoking spin. "Zu groß, zu schwer," wrote Lieutenant Heinz Mertens in his combat diary. "Too big, too heavy, they cannot fight at our altitude." The Americans were still learning. Their training had been rushed, their maintenance crews green, their tactics borrowed from single-engine doctrine that made no sense in a twin-boom machine built for altitude and reach. They tried to fight like Spitfires, turning and mixing with 190 seconds that could roll inside them. The Luftwaffe chalked up victories and grew careless. Yet amid the chaos, a few German pilots noticed something unsettling. On February 17th, near Kairouan, Oberfeldwebel Karl-Heinz Bendert riddled a P-38 from astern until its right engine flamed out. Expecting the twin-tailed fighter to fall away, he watched instead as it leveled, feathered the dead propeller, and climbed on a single engine, its pilot coolly retracting the landing gear and turning for the coast. "The damned thing flies with one motor," Bendert muttered afterward, still incredulous. "It should have fallen like a stone." That resilience became the Lightning's first whispered reputation. It would not die easily. When a single-engine Messerschmitt or Spitfire lost oil pressure or took a cannon hit, the pilot had seconds to bail out. The P-38 could take punishment, feather a prop, and limp home across hundreds of miles of hostile desert or sea. Recovery teams found downed Lightnings riddled with holes yet intact, their pilots alive, their stories spreading across Allied mess halls. In March, over the Gulf of Tunis, a mixed formation from the 1st and 14th Fighter Groups intercepted Ju-88 seconds, escorted by Bf-109 seconds from JG-77. Lieutenant Jack Ilfrey dove from 25,000 feet, firing from long range, his concentrated battery of 4 50-caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon all mounted in the nose. Unlike wing-mounted guns that converged awkwardly, the P-38's centerline armament fired straight ahead, with surgical precision. One Ju-88 disintegrated under the impact, another trailed smoke. The German escort dove in pursuit, confident of an easy kill. But when Ilfrey pulled into a shallow climb, both Allisons screaming through their turbo-superchargers, the 109 seconds fell behind. They just went straight up, one German report noted in disbelief. Impossible for us to follow. By April 1943, The laughter in Luftwaffe dispersal huts had softened. The Americans were learning quickly. Colonel James H. Howard's 1st Fighter Group began flying disciplined high-altitude cover rather than mixing it up at low levels. They discovered the Lightning's true nature, not a knife fighter, but a predator. At 30,000 feet, its twin turbo-supercharged engines delivered power that no German single-engine fighter could match. Above 25,000, the BMW-powered 190 seconds wheezed, their mechanical superchargers choking on thin air, while the P-38's exhaust-driven turbines kept it climbing like a homesick angel. The Germans, accustomed to ruling the upper sky, now faced an enemy that could dive faster, zoom higher, and shoot straighter. A veteran of JG-27, Hauptmann Erich Hohagen, wrote home after an encounter near Cape Bon. "They appear from above like silver birds, shoot once, and vanish. No warning, only the tracers and the holes in your wing." Still, the Americans paid heavily for their education. Compressibility, the mysterious force that froze controls at high speed, claimed more P-38 seconds than German guns that spring. Pilots learned too late that diving past 500 miles per hour could lock the elevators rigid, trapping the aircraft in a deadly plunge until thicker air restored control. Training bulletins circulated through the 12th Air Force. Warning: push the nose down, cut power, and pray. The Luftwaffe credited several victories to what were really aerodynamic mysteries of transonic flight. On the ground, the Germans refined their jokes. Mechanics at Trapani scrawled Zweimotorige, Sarg, twin-engine coffin, on mess hall blackboards. Pilots made forked tail gestures before missions, a private theatre of bravado. But when the first captured Lightning was examined at Rechlin in May, the engineer's humour vanished. The inspection report, later recovered in Allied archives, noted dryly, "Extremely high construction standard, turbo-supercharger arrangement superior to our systems. Armament concentrated and effective." The same officers who laughed at its shape now studied its ducting and intercoolers with professional respect. In Sicily, that summer, the P-38 seconds of the 82nd and 14th Fighter Groups flew from bases carved into dust, escorting B-25 seconds and B-26 seconds on the long runs to Palermo and Messina. The Luftwaffe was stretched thin, its aces fighting exhaustion as much as enemy pilots. When the Lightning appeared, its twin contrails glittering above the bombers, there was a collective tightening of stomachs. The fork-tailed devil had become a recognized adversary. Lieutenant Hans-Joachim Marseille's surviving comrades in JG-27 men who had once ruled the desert found themselves ambushed from altitudes they could not reach. Their warning came too late, a glint of silver, a long dive, and the sky filled with fire. The same pilots who mocked the Lightning's bulk now complained that its diving attack was unanswerable. In gun camera footage, recovered from downed aircraft, Messerschmitts are seen disintegrating under convergent tracers, torn apart before the pilot could react. By the end of 1943's North African campaign, the statistics told a quiet truth. The P-38's kill-loss ratio had climbed steadily as tactics evolved. Its long range let it escort bombers beyond the reach of Spitfires or Warhawks. Its reliability meant fewer pilots lost to engine failure or fuel starvation. And for every Lightning shot down, German reports noted, the pilot often survived to fight again, another luxury the Luftwaffe could no longer afford. The smirk that had greeted the Lightning's debut faded into wary silence. The name Gabelschwanz-Teufel remained, but now it was spoken with a different edge, less ridicule, more respect, even fear. What had begun as a joke among confident men was becoming an omen. Somewhere over the blue glitter of the Mediterranean, in that thin, bright air where engines gasped and wings trembled, the Germans had met an enemy they could not quite understand, a machine built by a nation that believed in power through persistence, not elegance. And beneath those twin booms, the laughter died away. From a distance, the Lockheed P-38 Lightning still looked wrong, like two aircraft stitched together by a mistake. But in the hangars at Maison Blanche and Yux-les-Bains, where engineers and mechanics tore into its guts under desert sun, its strangeness began to make mathematical sense. Every curve, every duct, Every pound of metal had a purpose written not in aesthetics, but in equations of altitude, pressure, and power. At its heart sat two Allison V1710F engines, mirror images driving counter-rotating propellers. Where a single-engine fighter wrestled torque and asymmetric thrust, the P-38's design cancelled both. Push the throttles forward, and the aircraft rose cleanly, straight as an arrow. Feather one propeller, and the other carried you home. To German engineers used to coaxing every ounce of power from a single inline Daimler-Benz, the concept seemed profligate too of everything. Double the maintenance, double the waste. To the Americans, it was insurance. The Allisons breathed through a pair of General Electric turbo-superchargers buried deep in the tail booms. Exhaust gases drove turbines that forced air back into the engines, restoring sea-level power at 30,000 feet. No German fighter possessed such a system. The Luftwaffe's mechanical superchargers gulped thin air and faltered above 25,000. The Lightning thrived there. Its twin turbines screamed like banshees, small jet engines before jets existed, giving the P-38 the rare gift of true high-altitude dominance. Inside the cockpit, the pilot sat cocooned in a greenhouse of perspex, ringed by systems that felt closer to a bomber's complexity than a fighter's simplicity. Twin throttles, twin mixture levers, twin propeller controls, a tangle of boost gauges and cowl flap switches. New pilots called it an octopus. Veterans called it a symphony. Mastering it meant learning to think in symmetry, one eye on each manifold pressure needle, each temperature gauge. "The airplane doesn't forgive sloppiness," wrote Captain Erwin Stovall of the 82nd Fighter Group. "Treat the engines like brothers. If one's unhappy, the other soon will be." Forward of the cockpit stretched the Lightning's secret weapon, a blunt nose housing four 50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns and a single Hispano 20mm cannon. Unlike every contemporary fighter Spitfire, Bf 109, W 190, whose guns were spaced across the wings and required careful harmonization to converge their bullets at a fixed distance, the Lightning's weapons were clustered along the centerline. The result was terrifying accuracy. At 400 yards, the stream of fire struck wherever the gun sight rested. No crossover, no dispersion. You pointed, you pressed, and whatever was there ceased to exist, remembered Lieutenant Robert Pettit. This architecture owed as much to Lockheed's design team as to wartime necessity. Chief Engineer Clarence Kelly Johnson had argued in 1938 that the future belonged to speed, climb, and concentrated fire. The Army had wanted a high-altitude interceptor. Johnson gave them a twin-engine rifle with wings. The prototype XP-38 was the first American fighter to exceed 400 miles per hour in level flight, a fact that stunned the Army Air Corps and frightened the engineers who knew how fragile the materials of 1939 still were. By 1943, the Lightning was no longer a prototype but a production miracle. Each aircraft contained 22,000 individual parts, 5 miles of electrical wiring, and almost 7,000 rivets. Lockheed's Burbank plant turned out one every 90 minutes. The two Allisons alone required 18,000 machining operations and tolerances measured in 10,000ths of an inch. The scale of the enterprise astonished visiting British officers. "It is not so much that they have built an airplane," one RAF engineer remarked, "but that they have built a system for making more of them than anyone could possibly need." That system included the bullets they fired. A single P-38 sortie demanded 500 pounds of ammunition, and American factories delivered it in unbroken rivers, belted, boxed, and shipped across the Atlantic faster than the Luftwaffe could dream of resupply. Where German aces nursed 200 rounds per cannon, Lightning pilots sprayed 15-second bursts without hesitation. It was not profligacy, it was arithmetic. In the industrial war that 1943 was becoming, the nation that could produce 10,000 bullets for every one of the enemies had already chosen the winner. Engineers in the Air Technical Intelligence section dissected downed P-38 seconds to understand why they returned from missions their peers never survived. The answers were everywhere: redundant hydraulic lines, armor plate behind the seat, bulletproof windscreen, self-sealing tanks in both booms, even a fuel transfer system that could balance loads automatically when one side was shot. The Lightning's structure was overbuilt, its skin thick where others were thin. "It's the only fighter I know," a mechanic said, "where you can land with half a tail missing and still taxi to the dispersal point." Yet none of this mattered without the men who learned to trust it. In the desert of North Africa, mechanics sweated in the open sun to keep the turbochargers alive against sand that clogged every intake. Pilots memorized emergency checklists until they could shut down an engine, feather a prop, and reset trim by reflex. Each mistake cost lives. Each success refined the tribe's ritual knowledge. Slowly, a culture of precision replaced improvisation. They stopped laughing at the complexity because they realized it was power disguised as patience. When the Germans examined captured wrecks, they found evidence of an alien design philosophy. The Lightning was not a duelist's weapon, but a mathematician's built around redundancy, stability, and reach. Its twin engines meant not 2 chances to survive, but 2 axes of control. Its twin tails reduced yaw, allowing perfect aim in a dive. Its central armament converted that aim into certainty. Gabelschwanz-Teufel, the fork-tailed devil, was no longer a joke but a recognition of something methodical and remorseless in American engineering. By late spring 1943, the pilots who had once cursed its quirks began to speak of it with quiet awe. They had seen Lightnings crawl home over Sicily on one engine, streaming fuel and smoke, and land safely. They had watched their tracers walk across the sky in an unbroken beam that shredded bombers in seconds. And above 30,000 feet, where the world thinned to pale blue, and engines gasped for breath, the twin Allisons still roared, turbochargers glowing cherry red, carrying the Lightning into a domain where few enemies dared to follow. The laughter that had greeted the P-38's arrival in Africa was already fading, replaced by the uneasy respect that precedes fear. The Germans were learning the first law of the Lightning. What looked awkward from the ground became inevitable in the sky. Its twin booms were not a flaw but a formula, and the numbers were beginning to work in America's favor. By midsummer 1943, the laughter had vanished from the Luftwaffe's ready rooms. In the barracks of JG 53 near Palermo, the word Gabelschwanz-Teufel, fork-tailed devil, was still spoken, but now it carried the gravity of a curse. The Americans had learned how to fight their twin-boomed monster properly, and the sky above the Mediterranean began to tilt in their favor. The transformation started quietly. In May, the 1st and 82nd Fighter Groups shifted tactics under 13 Fighter Command. Gone were the reckless turning duels at 10,000 feet. The new doctrine was simple. Altitude is armor, speed is survival. The P-38 was ordered to fight vertically, not horizontally, to dive like a hammer and climb like a prayer. Pilots drilled for weeks on energy retention, throttle coordination, and formation discipline. They practiced boom and zoom passes, each attack timed to the second, each pull-out calculated by airspeed tables copied from Lockheed engineering memos. The results were immediate and devastating. On June 10, 1943, over the approaches to Pantelleria, a formation of 12 Lightnings from the 82nd Group intercepted a flight of Bf-109Gs from JG-77 climbing to intercept Allied bombers. Captain William D. Leverett spotted the enemy first tiny specks spiraling upward below and rolled inverted into a shallow dive from 28,000 feet. The Germans never saw the attack. In 8 seconds, the P-38 seconds flashed through their formation, 8 .50 calibers and a 20mm cannon from each nose, shredding 2 Messerschmitts before the rest could even jettison their drop tanks. The Lightnings climbed away, regrouped, and struck again. When the brief fight ended, 6 109 seconds fell into the sea. All 12 P-38 seconds returned home. They attacked like ghosts, wrote Lieutenant Rudolf Hirsch of JG-77. Too high, too fast by the time you saw them, they were already gone. This was no accident of surprise. It was mathematics in motion. The turbo-superchargers that had seemed maintenance nightmares now paid their dividend. Above 25,000 feet, the P-38 could still produce 1,400 horsepower per engine, while the Luftwaffe's mechanical superchargers wheezed out half that. The German pilots, once masters of altitude, found themselves caught between underpowered climbs and deadly dives they could not follow. It was like trying to fight gravity itself, one post-war interrogation transcript records. By July, the Lightning had become the long-range hammer of the Mediterranean. Its radius allowed it to escort bombers deep into Sicilian airspace where Spitfires could not reach. The 14th Fighter Group's mission logs show daily sorties exceeding 400 miles, a distance previously thought impossible for a fighter escort. "We had the legs for it," remembered Lieutenant Rex Barber. 2 engines meant we could run high power for hours and still have gas to come home. At altitude, the Germans discovered another unsettling trait, the precision of the P-38's centerline fire. Every hit landed where the gun sight pointed. Bf 109 pilots returning to base described being torn apart by single, concentrated bursts that stitched straight through the fuselage, instead of the wide wing-mounted spread they expected. "They shoot like snipers," complained Oberfeldwebel Johann Kretschmer in his combat diary. "No need to close distance. One burst, and you are finished." Even when the Luftwaffe adapted, the Americans kept rewriting the script. The new tactic of bounce and break, diving from altitude, firing once, and rolling into a vertical climb, turned every engagement into a lesson in momentum. German instructors lectured their recruits. Never follow a Lightning into a dive, never chase one uphill. But doctrine could not overcome physics. On July 25th, during the invasion of Sicily, JG-53 scrambled from Comiso to intercept B-25 seconds headed for Messina. 6 P-38 seconds of the first group caught them crossing the coast. The Americans dove through cloud at 480 miles per hour, guns blazing. In less than 2 minutes, 4 109 seconds were down. Lieutenant Franz Weber bailed out, his parachute blossoming against the sun. From below, he saw the strange twin-tailed fighters turning in unison, climbing back into the light. "They looked like machines from another world," he said years later. The numbers began to shift. By September 1943, Allied intelligence estimated the Lightning's kill-to-loss ratio in the Mediterranean at nearly 4-1, rivaling that of the Spitfire. More telling was the psychological impact. Luftwaffe combat reports began describing the P-38 as unreachable and immune to damage. One pilot noted bitterly, "You may hit him, but he flies away. You may follow, but he vanishes into the sun." To the Americans, it was vindication. The aircraft, once dismissed as over-engineered, was now rewriting air combat theory. The twin engines, once symbols of complexity, became the keys to dominance. A P-38 could afford aggression. If flak shredded one engine, the other brought it home. Pilots stopped fearing long-range missions because the Lightning's reliability turned distance into safety. Lockheed's engineers tracked this progress with scientific detachment. Factory bulletins noted field modifications, strengthened dive recovery flaps to solve compressibility lockups, coolant line rerouting to prevent high-altitude freezing, radio upgrades for coordinated group attacks. Each improvement closed a chapter of painful experience and opened another inefficiency. The Lightning was evolving in real time, its pilots the test subjects of a living laboratory. For the Luftwaffe, the adjustment was slower. JG-77's Tactics Manual for Autumn 1943 includes a new section titled Bekämpfung zweimotoriger Jagdflugzeuge, Combating Twin-Engine Fighters. It advised head-on attacks, quick dives, and disengagement if the fight rose above 25,000 feet. The very existence of the document admitted what every pilot already knew. The Americans now owned the upper air. The nickname Gabelschwanz-Teufel endured because it fit, not as mockery, but as warning. The twin tails no longer looked clumsy, they looked like horns. The Lightning had become a predator shaped by science and built by a nation that understood mass production as a weapon. When the invasion of Italy began that September, P-38 seconds roamed ahead of the bombers, cutting rail lines, strafing airfields, ambushing fleeing convoys. They arrived at will and left untouched. The Germans stopped laughing not because they lost aircraft, but because they lost control of altitude, of initiative, of the narrative of superiority they had carried since 1939. "Once we thought them foolish," wrote a captured Luftwaffe officer in 1944. "Now, when we see the twin tails glinting above the clouds, we know the fight will go badly. The devil has learned to fly." The 18th of April 1943, the Pacific dawn shimmered across Bougainville, turning the sea to molten silver. In the humid air above the Solomon Islands, 18 P-38 Lightnings of the 339th Fighter Squadron carved invisible arcs across the sky, throttles set to an exact power curve that engineers in California had calculated to the decimal. Their mission was so audacious it bordered on impossible an intercept at the edge of the airplane's range, guided only by mathematics and faith in the machine's twin hearts. They were hunting a man, not a formation. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Imperial Japanese Navy, architect of Pearl Harbor. American codebreakers had intercepted his travel itinerary. He would be flying that morning from Rabaul to Balal in a formation of 2 G4M Betty bombers and 6 Zero fighters. The plan, drawn up by Major John Mitchell and sanctioned by Admiral Nimitz himself, called for a 600-mile one-way flight from Guadalcanal beyond the reach of any other Allied fighter. The P-38, with its long range and twin engines, was the only aircraft that could do it. Each detail was calculated with ruthless precision. The Lightnings stripped down to bare essentials. No external paint except for dull aluminum, 2 165-gallon drop tanks slung under the wings, and ammunition carefully weighed to balance fuel load. Takeoff time, 0700 hours. Sharp. Intercept altitude, 10,000 feet. Estimated arrival at the ambush point, 0934 hours. At that moment, Yamamoto's flight would be 300 miles north of Guadalcanal, flying along the coast of Bougainville if the Americans' navigation and fuel calculations were perfect. If they were not, 18 P-38 seconds would vanish into the Pacific with empty tanks. The plan depended on everything the Lightning represented: engineering discipline, range, endurance, and the quiet confidence that redundancy meant survival. Each aircraft carried 1,200 gallons of fuel, enough for nearly 6 hours of flight. The twin turbo-supercharged Allisons would run lean at 2,300 revolutions per minute, 27 inches of manifold pressure, delivering exactly the fuel economy predicted by Lockheed's engineers. The pilots flew at wave-top height, sometimes 20 feet above the ocean, to evade radar. The twin engines howled in unison, their mirrored propellers cutting twin wakes across the surface like the signatures of some mechanical sea creature. As the formation crossed into enemy airspace, every system was running on arithmetic. Navigator Lieutenant Rex Barber checked his stopwatch against the sun's azimuth. Major Mitchell, leading, adjusted course 1 degree east for crosswind drift. The P-38 seconds were now 400 miles from home. In single-engine fighters, that distance meant death if anything went wrong. But the men of the 339th trusted the redundancy under their hands. If one Allison failed, the other would carry them back. It was the same cold logic that had saved their comrades in Africa and Sicily. At 0934, exactly as planned, lookouts spotted dark specks over the jungle canopy. "Bogies, 11 o'clock high," Mitchell called. The twin-tailed devils rose from the sea. 2 sections climbed to cut off the escorting Zeros, while Captain Thomas Lanphier and Lieutenant Barber swung beneath the bombers. In the chaos that followed, the Lightning's nose-mounted guns proved decisive. At 300 yards, Barber's burst raked the leading G4M, fire blossomed instantly, and the bomber disintegrated in mid-air. Japanese records later confirmed that Yamamoto's aircraft had crashed into the jungle, killing all aboard. The mission, Operation Vengeance, lasted less than 10 minutes. Its planning had taken weeks. Its success rested entirely on the Lightning's unique design. No other fighter in the world could have flown that far, that fast, and still fought. The intercept became a case study in applied engineering, range from twin engines, precision from centerline guns, victory from calculation. Back in the Mediterranean, Luftwaffe analysts studying intercepted American reports noted the feat with unease. If accurate, read a JG-53 intelligence circular from June 1943. The American twin-engine fighter demonstrates reach exceeding all known single-engine types. Strategic implications, significant. For the first time, German officers began to understand that the strange twin-tailed machine was not a theater experiment, but a global instrument, a fighter that could serve in any sky. Operation Vengeance also revealed something deeper about American air power, its capacity for orchestration. The mission required cryptographers, logisticians, navigators, and engineers working in invisible harmony. It was the industrial mirror of what German pilots were beginning to experience over Europe and the Mediterranean, the sense that the Americans fought not as individuals, but as a system. The Japanese would later call the attack a masterpiece of precision. The Americans described it as revenge wrapped in mathematics, but for the men who flew it, it proved that the P-38's twin engines were not a luxury, they were freedom. Lieutenant Barber, in his after-action report preserved in Air Force archives, wrote simply, "No other airplane could have done this." News of the mission spread quietly through Allied squadrons. In Tunisia, pilots of the 82nd Group heard the story, second-hand. A Lightning, they were told, had flown 1,200 miles, killed Japan's greatest admiral, and returned home with fuel to spare. Around mess tents and flight lines, the reaction was part pride, part revelation. If the Lightning could reach that far over the Pacific, there was nothing it couldn't reach in Europe. In Germany, captured intelligence officers scoffed at first, calling the intercept impossible. Yet by late 1943, they began instructing pilots to expect two-motor American fighters of great altitude and radius. The laughter of early 1943 had given way to grim respect. They knew now that what seemed ungainly from the ground concealed an equation of deadly precision. Operation Vengeance would become one of the most mythologized air missions of the war, but its real legacy lay in what it revealed, that the P-38's twin engines weren't merely propulsion, they were time and distance weaponized. They allowed a fighter to do what strategy demanded rather than what physics allowed. From that April morning over Bougainville onward, the world understood that the Lightning's design was no eccentric American indulgence. It was a new grammar of warfare, written in aluminum and turbocharger heat, capable of rewriting geography itself. And as word of the Pacific mission filtered through Allied ranks and Axis intelligence alike, one truth hardened across both oceans. The fork-tailed devil was no longer a curiosity. It was a promise that nowhere on Earth, not even 600 miles beyond friendly lines, was beyond the reach of those twin roaring engines. By late 1943, the P-38 Lightning was no longer the awkward twin-tailed enigma that had stumbled through its early missions over North Africa. It had become a weapon of precision, its pilots molded by hard lessons in aerodynamics and survival. The crude dogfights of Tunisia had given way to the cold geometry of energy combat. In the 1st, 14th, and 82nd Fighter Groups stationed across Italy and the Pleuret, Mediterranean, the new doctrine was summed up in a simple, hard-edged mantra: don't turn, climb, dive, and shoot. This philosophy had been born from blood. Every pilot who had tried to outturn a Bf 109 or Focke-Wulfs 190 had paid the same price: altitude, then airspeed, then life. But when Lightning pilots fought vertically, they discovered their airplane's true nature. It was not a knife fighter, it was a sledgehammer dropped from the heavens. At Foggia in early December 1943, Captain William Leverett drilled his men on energy fighting. He lectured in the briefing hut, chalk squealing against the blackboard as he drew looping parabolas. "You own the sky above 25,000, he said, "but only if you stay there. Dive to attack, climb to reload. Never fight on their terms." Behind him hung a diagram copied from Lockheed's technical bulletin, detailing the Lightning's dive limits and recovery procedures. Those limits had once terrified pilots. Early P-38 seconds had an alarming tendency to lock up in high-speed dives. The controls froze solid as compressibility forces stiffened the elevator. Many never pulled out. The problem had been aerodynamic. At Mach 0.68, the airflow over the thick wing sections went supersonic, creating shock waves that paralyzed control surfaces. It was a frontier of physics no pilot had faced before. Lockheed's engineers, led by Kelly Johnson, responded with science instead of superstition. They redesigned the elevator balances, added dive recovery flaps to the underside of each wing, and rewrote the pilot's checklist. Now, when a P-38 dove at 500 miles per hour, the flaps automatically restored airflow over the tail, letting the pilot pull out safely. The new system arrived in theatre by late 1943, and suddenly the Lightning's greatest fear became its greatest weapon. Lieutenant Jack Ilfrey of the 1st Fighter Group described the change in his logbook. "Before, we dreaded the dive, now we hunt with it." He tested the new flaps over the Tyrrhenian Sea, pushing the throttles full forward until the Mach needle quivered. The Lightning knifed downwards, engines screaming, then levelled with a gentle pull. "She came out smooth as silk," he wrote. "Now the Germans can't hide below us." With the fear of compressibility gone, P-38 squadrons rewrote the rules of engagement. Altitude became ammunition. Pilots climbed to 30,000 feet, cruising lean on turbocharged Allisons, then dove at 480 miles per hour onto bomber interceptors or retreating fighters. Their gunnery runs lasted 3 seconds at most, 1 pass, 1 kill, then a climb back into thin, safe air. The 8 guns in the Lightning's nose, 4 Brownings, and a Hispano cannon fired straight ahead, their tracers converging like a welding torch. When that concentrated stream hit, the effect was instantaneous. German pilots began to call the new tactics Blitzstoß, lightning strike. In radio intercepts recorded by Allied monitoring posts, the panic was clear. "Achtung, Doppelmotorige, Jäger, oben." Attention, twin-engine fighters above. Bf 109 seconds scrambled to climb and meet them, but the P-38 seconds always struck first, using speed as armor. At high altitude, the Lightning's strengths multiplied. The twin turbo-superchargers fed each engine with compressed air, maintaining full power at altitudes where Luftwaffe fighters gasped. The Germans' Daimler-Benz 605 has lost nearly 25% of output above 25,000 feet. The Lightning's Allisons lost less than 5%. That difference turned dogfights into equations. The higher the altitude, the longer the Lightning ruled. In one engagement on the 24th of January 1944, near Anzio, 12 P-38 seconds of the 82nd Fighter Group intercepted 20 German fighters attempting to dive on Allied shipping. The Americans came in from 33,000 feet, descending like a storm. The battle lasted less than 5 minutes. 7 enemy aircraft fell in flames. Not one Lightning was lost. Afterward, Lieutenant Jack Horsch summed it up in a single line. "They never saw us. We dropped from the sun, fired once, and were gone." Training now emphasized mechanical empathy. Pilots learned to balance propeller pitch and throttle with fingertip precision. Asymmetric thrust could kill in a heartbeat, one careless movement, and the Lightning would yaw violently. But those who mastered it found new possibilities. They could roll faster, turn tighter under power, even climb on one engine while feathering the other to conserve fuel. Each pilot became half engineer, half hunter. The ground crews mirrored that professionalism. In the maintenance sheds at Foggia, mechanics knew every hiss and tick of the twin Allisons. They synchronized turbochargers by ear, tuned magnetos by hand, and kept oil systems immaculate. A well-serviced Lightning could fly 12-hour days without falter. It was a level of mechanical reliability the Luftwaffe could no longer match. The Americans also learned discipline. Gone were the reckless chases of 1,942. Squadrons attacked in tight finger-four formations, each pilot guarding another's tail. Radio silence was enforced until the kill. The P-38 had become a machine of teamwork, not bravado, a reflection of the industrial system that produced it. German after-action reports from early 1944 noted this shift with grudging respect. "They fight like machines," wrote Oberleutnant Erich Schuster of JG 53. "Always in formation, always with altitude, never rash. They attack and disappear. We are fighting an assembly line." That was exactly what the Americans intended. The P-38's evolution from an ungainly curiosity to a precision instrument mirrored America's own transition from improvisation to mastery. The Lightning had taught its pilots and its nation that victory in the air no longer depended on daring alone. It depended on control, of engines, of altitude, of discipline. By early 1944, when P-38 seconds escorted B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds deep into German airspace, they no longer feared the Luftwaffe's best. They flew higher, faster, and longer, guided by that uncompromising rule written in every squadron briefing: don't turn, climb, dive, and shoot. It wasn't just advice. It was doctrine, the distilled essence of modern air combat. The Lightning had stopped being an airplane and become something greater, a system of war, executed with mechanical precision and human will, turning the very sky into geometry and death. When the P-38 arrived in northern Europe in late 1943, the Luftwaffe assumed it would fail. The Mediterranean skies were one thing warm, wide, and forgiving. The frigid, cloud-racked corridors of Western Europe were another matter entirely. To German pilots of JG-26 Schlageter and JG-2 Richthofen, the Lightning looked too big, too complicated, too American. They watched it circle over England and sneered. Zweimotorige Irrtum, the twin-engine mistake. They were wrong. The first major test came on the 13th of December 1943, when P-38 seconds of the 55th Fighter Group swept across the North Sea, escorting B-17 seconds bound for Bremen. At 28,000 feet, the air temperature was 30 degrees below zero, the contrails thick and unbroken. The Germans came at them head-on, 30 Bf 109Gs, led by ace Joachim Müncheberg's old unit. The Americans held formation, silent, patient. Captain Perry Dahl, the leader, waited until the Germans filled his windscreen, then snapped the throttles forward. The twin turbochargers roared, and the Lightnings lunged upward in unison. The German attack disintegrated in seconds. The P-38 seconds dove through the center of the 109 seconds, guns blazing. Their concentrated, nose-mounted fire 4.50 calibers and 120 mm tore through cockpits and wings like artillery shells. The survivors tried to climb after them, but the Lightnings were already gone, streaking back up through the contrail layer. When the formation landed, gun camera film confirmed 6 kills. Not a single P-38 had been lost. The Luftwaffe pilots, used to dueling Spitfires and Mustangs, found themselves confounded by the Lightning's two greatest advantages: altitude and endurance. It could loiter above the bombers for hours, conserving fuel with one engine throttled back, then strike and climb again. And if a shell punctured an oil line or shredded a propeller, the other engine carried it home. "You could kill a 109 with one burst," recalled Lati. John Voll of the 479th Fighter Group, but it took the whole Luftwaffe to kill a P-38. Yet the European theatre exposed every flaw as well. The bitter cold caused cockpit heaters to fail and turbochargers to freeze. Condensation shorted radios. Early P-38J models lacked cockpit insulation, and frost bloomed on instrument panels. Pilots joked grimly that the Lightning was the only fighter where your breath could kill your gun sight. Some died when canopy glass fogged over entirely during dives, blinding them in the split second between life and oblivion. Lockheed responded with the same relentless pragmatism that had defined the plane from the beginning. Crews retrofitted new heating systems, fuel preheaters, and improved cockpit seals. The result was the P-38J-25, the definitive European Lightning, warm, pressurized, and deadly. By spring 1944, it was fully operational. With the technical problems solved, the Lightning took on a new role: long-range escort. Before the arrival of the Mustang, the P-38 was the only Allied fighter capable of accompanying bombers deep into Germany. Its 300-gallon drop tanks gave it a 1,400-mile range, enough to cover Berlin and back. Colonel Jack Jenkins of the 55th Fighter Group described the first missions as a mechanical miracle. We went to Berlin and still had the power to fight. In February 1944, during Big Week, the Allied campaign to destroy the German aircraft industry, the Lightnings proved their worth. On February 20th, 821 American bombers struck Leipzig, escorted by mixed groups of P-47 seconds, Mustangs, and Lightnings. Near Magdeburg, 55th Group P-38 seconds clashed with JG-11. The Germans dived from 25,000 feet, confident they could outturn the bulky twin-engine fighters. But the Lightnings didn't turn. They dropped their tanks, rolled inverted, and went into near-vertical dives. The Luftwaffe pilots tried to follow and learned, too late, about compressibility. Their aircraft shuddered, then disintegrated. One German pilot, Oberfeldwebel Gerhard Schuler, survived to tell his debriefing officer, "They dove like stones. We could not follow. They fired once, and our formation broke apart. I saw one with both engines flaming, but he climbed still." We no longer laughed. By mid-1944, Luftwaffe records listed the P-38 as a high-altitude, twin-engine interceptor of extreme danger. Their reports advised engaging only from below, in numbers, and never in vertical pursuit. The very shape that had once seemed awkward, those twin booms and central nacelle, was now instantly recognizable and dreaded. It became a silhouette of doom over occupied Europe. The Lightning's impact wasn't limited to combat performance, it reshaped morale. Bomber crews, once flying into flak clouds with only short-range cover, now looked out their plexiglass noses to see the twin tails of P-38 seconds glinting in the sun. It was like having angels with engines, one B-17 navigator recalled. But perhaps the most telling measure of respect came from the enemy. By late 1944, the Germans had coined new slang for the aircraft. Der Gabelschwanz-Teufel was no longer a joke, it was an epitaph. Ground troops on the Western Front recognized it instantly. The glinting, forked silhouette descending in a dive, the scream of turbochargers growing into thunder. They learned to dive for cover the moment that sound reached their ears. As winter gave way to spring, the P-38's role expanded yet again: fighter-bomber, reconnaissance platform, even pathfinder. The same aircraft that had once been mocked for indecision of purpose, became the most versatile American weapon in the European sky. And by then, the laughter that had once echoed in German ready rooms had been replaced by a different sound entirely: the staccato growl of twin Allisons at full boost, the unmistakable forked shadow racing across the clouds. The twin-engine mistake had become the twin-engine judgment. By the summer of 1944, the Luftwaffe was dying, but it did not die quietly. Germany's skies were still contested, and the men of JG-26 and JG-11, those few veteran squadrons still holding the Western Front, fought with the desperation of cornered predators. The Americans now came daily, hundreds of bombers droning eastward with fighter screens layered above them like a steel canopy. The P-38 Lightning flew at the highest tier of that umbrella: Guardian, Interceptor, and Hunter. What had begun as an ungainly experiment was now the spearhead of the U.S. 8th and 9th Air Forces. On July 7, 1944, the 479th Fighter Group launched from Wattisham, England, on a mission to escort B-17 seconds toward Leipzig. Among the pilots was Captain Jack Ilfrey, a veteran of North Africa who had once hated the Lightning's quirks and now trusted it like an extension of his own body. "You fly it right," he said later, "and it never lets you down." The formation climbed through broken cloud, silver contrails forming a geometric web behind them. At 27,000 feet, German radar stations along the Weser River detected their approach. JG-11 scrambled 24 Bf-109Gs under the command of Major Horst Petschler. The German pilots, fueled by meager rations and running on synthetic fuel that fouled engines, still fought with the old professionalism. "We could not surrender the sky," Petschler recalled after the war. Every American formation that reached Berlin was another wound to Germany's heart. The two forces met just after noon. The lightnings were stacked high, protecting the bomber stream. Petzschler's 109 seconds came up in a climbing spiral, sunlight flashing from their canopies. The Germans intended to lure the P-38 seconds into turning combat at medium altitude, where the 109 could still outroll and outclimb most Allied aircraft. But the Americans had learned the rules of energy warfare too well. Ilfrey spotted the Germans first. "Bogies, 3 o'clock high," he radioed calmly. "Let's drop in and say hello." He pushed the throttles forward. The twin Allisons roared in harmony, turbochargers whining like turbines. The formation rolled inverted and dove through 10,000 feet in seconds, the airspeed needle brushing 480. The Germans scattered, caught off guard by the sheer velocity of the attack. Ilfrey's gun camera captured it one pass, a burst of tracers, a 109 shearing apart in mid-air. The battle dissolved into a series of vertical duels. German pilots tried to climb into the Lightning's dives, but their engines gasped in the thin air. At 30,000 feet, the Lightning's twin superchargers still delivered full manifold pressure. The Messerschmitts were throttled to near idle. It was like fighting uphill through water, remembered Petzschler. They could choose when to attack, when to leave. We could only react. The P-38 seconds struck and climbed again, their speed bleeding into altitude like stored electricity. Below them, bombers droned unmolested toward their targets. In less than 10 minutes, the Germans had lost 8 aircraft, the Americans, none. When the 479th landed that evening, maintenance crews counted more empty gun belts than fuel left in the tanks. The system worked altitude, discipline, and overwhelming firepower. But the victory was not without cost. The Lightning's high-altitude superiority came at the price of endurance. Pilots returned half-frozen, their hands blistered from gripping metal throttles in -40 air. Frostbite became as common as flak wounds. "You didn't sweat in the Lightning," said Lauti, John Voll. "You froze, you shook, and you prayed the cockpit heater worked." Still, the results were irrefutable. By late July, Luftwaffe controllers began issuing standing orders: avoid combat above 25,000 feet unless attacking bombers directly. The Lightning's twin-engine silhouette had become a warning sign. Even flak batteries were told to conserve ammunition when the fork-tailed shapes appeared. Their speed and altitude made them almost untouchable. Yet the Germans were not finished adapting. In September 1944, the first Me-262 jet fighters appeared over Bavaria. Sleek, silver, and impossibly fast, they streaked through bomber formations with impunity. At 540 miles per hour, no propeller aircraft could catch them in level flight. But the Lightning pilots found the cracks. They discovered that the jets were vulnerable during takeoff and landing, slow, heavy with fuel, and easy to intercept. On October 12, 1944, Lieutenant James Kenny of the 367th Fighter Group spotted a pair of Me-262 seconds on approach to Lechfeld Airfield. He dove from 28,000 feet, throttles wide open. The Lightnings screamed past 500 miles per hour, matching the jets in a headlong dive. Kenny fired at 400 yards. One burst tore through the right engine of the lead 262, which rolled and exploded on impact. It was the first confirmed jet kill by a P-38. That same month, Luftwaffe reports began to describe the Lightning in language that bordered on awe. Capable of pursuit of jet aircraft under limited conditions. Excellent gunnery accuracy. Armament heavy enough to destroy any type. The fork-tailed devil that had once been mocked as clumsy now hunted the most advanced aircraft in existence. By the autumn of 1944, the Luftwaffe's surviving aces, men who had outlived the Battle of Britain, Russia, and the Mediterranean, spoke of the P-38 with respect tinged by dread. "It was the sound," said Oberleutnant Otto Friesen, of JG-26. "That strange twin hum, you'd hear it above, the clouds, and you knew it wasn't one of ours. Then the shadows crossed the sun, and you knew it was time to die." The Lightning had achieved what its designers could scarcely have imagined in 1939, mastery of the European sky. It was not the fastest, nor the most agile, nor the most beautiful, but it was relentless, an engineer's war machine that turned altitude into weaponry and mathematics into murder. And as 1944 gave way to the bitter winter of 1945, even the proudest German squadrons no longer spoke its name with derision. They spoke it with quiet fatalism. The fork-tailed phantom had become the herald of inevitability, the sound of two engines marking the end of the Reich's reign in the air. By early 1945, the P-38 Lightning had become a veteran of two oceans. In Europe, it escorted B-17 seconds through contrails over the Ruhr. In the Pacific, it prowled volcanic archipelagos and jungle coasts. Its reputation had evolved from mockery to myth. The Luftwaffe had learned to fear it. The Japanese, too, whispered its name, Nituki no Akuma, the two-tailed devil. From Bougainville to Berlin, its twin booms had come to symbolize something larger than a fighter plane, the industrial heartbeat of a nation that would not stop building, flying, or learning. The winter of 1945 was bitter. In the Ardennes, P-38 seconds flew reconnaissance for the frozen ground troops during the Battle of the Bulge. In Italy, the 82nd and 14th Fighter Groups attacked retreating convoys on icy mountain roads, and over the Pacific, the 5th and 13th Air Forces used Lightnings to sever Japan's empire island by island. The same machine that had fought over Sicily now dove on destroyers in the South China Sea. Few aircraft in history had travelled so far or done so much. The Lightning's dual personality fighter and bomber, killer and scout, had matured into a doctrine. Pilots no longer thought of it as a twin-engine fighter. It was a multi-role system long before that term existed. Each squadron tailored its tactics to theatre needs. In Europe, Lightnings fought vertically and high. In the Pacific, they fought long and low, their turbo-superchargers feeding on warm air and tropical storms. Colonel Charles MacDonald of the 475th Fighter Group called it the only airplane that could fight all day and still come home hungry. The Luftwaffe, by contrast, was starving. Synthetic fuel shortages left many 109 seconds and 190 seconds grounded. Engines were run on alcohol blends that froze at altitude. Replacement pilots arrived with less than 80 flight hours, facing veterans flying aircraft with double their power and range. On February 9th, 1945, over Kassel, a handful of surviving JG-53 pilots tried to intercept an American bombing raid. They never reached the bombers. P-38 seconds from the 55th Fighter Group fell upon them at 29,000 feet. "We had nothing left," remembered Oberfeldwebel Ernst Bruckner in his 1946 interrogation. "The twin-tailed ones came from above. They did not turn. They fired, and we ceased to exist." The Lightning's lethality was not just in its guns, it was in its precision. Decades later, engineers examining gun camera film noted the remarkable consistency of hits. The P-38's centerline armament, unaffected by convergence issues, turned its entire nose into a laser pointer of death. Each burst was mathematically centered. German reports from early 1945 listed a grim statistic. More than 70% of Luftwaffe losses to Lightnings came from single-pass attacks at ranges under 400 yards. "They kill cleanly," one pilot wrote. "No waste, no chase." In the Pacific, that same precision became devastation. When the P-38 liters model arrived in late 1944 with 1,600 horsepower Allisons, hydraulically boosted ailerons, and zero-length rocket mounts, it became the most formidable ground attack aircraft in the theater. In the Philippines and Okinawa campaigns, squadrons of Lightnings erased entire convoys. A 4-second burst could ignite a column of trucks. A pair of 1,000-pound bombs could reduce a bridge to splinters. Japanese infantry learned to dive for water ditches the instant they heard the double-engine roar too late, usually. Colonel Thomas Maguire, the second highest-scoring U.S. ace of the war, flew the Lightning until his final mission. On January 7th, 1945, over Los Negros Island, his P-38 went down in a desperate low-altitude dogfight. His death symbolized the paradox of the Lightning itself, a machine of overwhelming firepower and engineering logic, flown by men who still risked everything on instinct. Back in Europe, the last Luftwaffe units collapsed under the weight of Allied dominance. On April 9, 1945, Major Horst Petzschler, who had once mocked the P-38 as a flying telephone pole, surrendered to US forces. "We could not climb above them, and we could not outlast them," he admitted to his interrogators. The fork-tailed devil was the shadow that never left the sun. That shadow stretched beyond the war. After 1945, the P-38 continued to serve as a mapping platform, a reconnaissance craft, and a symbol of the industrial precision that had won the air war. Its turbo-supercharger design influenced the jet age. Its gunsight harmonization, its electrical systems, even its pilot armor layouts became case studies in efficiency. The Lightning had rewritten not just tactics but the entire vocabulary of fighter engineering. At the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum, a polished P-38 liters gleams beneath soft light. Visitors marvel at its symmetry, the twin booms, the central pod, the perfection of balance that once looked so ungainly. Beneath the display lies a placard quoting a German officer captured in 1945. At first we laughed at the fork-tailed ones, then we feared them. At the end, we prayed not to see them again. The P-38's story ended not in laughter, nor even in triumph, but in vindication. Every line of its frame, the twin tails, the turbo ducts, the heavy nose had been drawn for logic, not beauty. Yet out of that logic came grace. Out of industrial arithmetic came something close to legend. By war's end, 9,923 enemy aircraft had fallen to P-38 seconds. But the greater number was unseen, the thousands who turned back, dove away, or never took off because they had heard that haunting sound, a double hum in the thin air, like the beating of enormous wings. That was the sound of inevitability, the echo of an age when geometry and courage shared the same sky. The Germans had once laughed at it, the world never would again.